In July 1946, the Japanese battleship Nagato was lying inside the lagoon of Bikini Atoll. Just 1 year earlier, she had still been a warship of the Japanese Navy. Now, she was no longer being used for combat. She had been captured by the Americans, brought to Bikini, and left among the target ships. But the strangest part came later. Nagato sank and simply remained there. There was no return to Japan, no dismantling, no attempt to restore her. Nearly 80 years later, her hull is still lying on the bottom of Bikini Atoll. So why was she never removed? To understand that, we need to look not only at Nagato's final hours, but also at the condition the ship was in when the war ended. Nagato was no longer the ship she had been at the beginning of the war. She had once been one of the most powerful battleships in the Japanese Navy. She was the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto when he commanded the Japanese combined fleet. But the war changed the situation dramatically. The Japanese Navy was losing fuel, aircraft, and warships. By 1945, Nagato was no longer operating as a full-scale ocean-going battleship. She remained at Yokosuka, where she served as a floating coastal defense battery. The ship was camouflaged. Her guns remained ready for use. But the possibility of taking her back to sea and returning to her former role was already almost gone. Then came July 1945. American aircraft attacked the naval base at Yokosuka. Nagato was damaged, but once again she remained afloat. And that detail matters, because when Japan surrendered a few weeks later, Nagato was still there. She had not been destroyed in battle. She had not been sunk by the American fleet, and she had not gone down with the other Japanese battleships. She had survived the war, and then she passed into the hands of the victors. That was when the final chapter of her history began. The Americans decided to use Nagato for the tests at Bikini Atoll. But after the tests were over, another question emerged. What should be done with the ships that remained? And this was where Nagato found herself in a very unusual position. She was no longer needed as a warship. She was damaged. She was contaminated by radiation, and returning her to Japan was not being considered. Nagato was left at Bikini. Then, just days after the second test, the battleship finally began to lose her buoyancy. Water slowly entered the hull. Nagato began to list, and eventually, on July 29, 1946, she sank. But the story that should have ended with the ship going beneath the water had actually only just begun. At that moment, Nagato was no longer simply a battleship that had sunk. She had become a wreck resting on the bottom of Bikini Lagoon. But why wasn't she raised? At first, it seems like a simple question. After all, Nagato was a massive warship built from thousands of tons of steel. After she sank, it would have been theoretically possible to raise her, tow her away, or dismantle her. But after the nuclear tests, the situation was very different. Nagato had been sitting in an area where nuclear explosions had taken place. Her hull had been contaminated by radioactive material, and that meant the ship could no longer be treated like an ordinary sunken warship. The problem wasn't simply whether Nagato could physically be raised. The real question was what would be done with her afterward. The ship no longer had any military value. Japan had lost the war. Its navy had effectively ceased to exist. And Nagato itself was already damaged, old, and radioactively contaminated. There was little reason to spend enormous resources bringing her back. So Nagato remained where she had sunk. But there is another important detail. She did not disappear into the darkness of a deep ocean trench. Nagato lies in relatively shallow water inside Bikini Lagoon. That made the wreck accessible to underwater researchers. Over time, divers were able to reach the remains of the ship, and gradually it became clear just how unusual this wreck really was. Nagato had not vanished into the deep ocean. She remained almost like a frozen moment in history. Her hull still rests on the seabed. Large sections of the structure remain visible. Parts of the ship still reveal what Nagato once was, But at the same time, the ocean is slowly changing her. The metal is corroding. The structures are weakening. Parts of the ship are breaking down. And with every passing year, Nagato becomes more and more a part of the underwater landscape of Bikini. That is why the question today isn't simply, where is Nagato? We already know where she is. The real question is, why is she still there? Because after she sank, Nagato stopped being a warship that needed to be returned or preserved. She became part of the place where her history ended. And that is exactly what makes the wreck so unusual. Today, Nagato can no longer be seen as just another sunken ship. She has become part of the history of Bikini Atoll itself. Once, this ship was a symbol of Japanese military power. She was built for naval combat. She served as a flagship. She survived years of war across the Pacific. Then her fate changed completely. After Japan surrendered, Nagato ended up in the hands of her former enemy. Instead of returning to Japan, she was brought among the target ships. Instead of a crew, researchers were studying her. Instead of a combat mission, she was given a role in a nuclear test. And instead of going home, she ended up on the bottom of the lagoon. But Nagato is also interesting because of what happened after she sank. She was not raised. She was not towed away. She was not dismantled for scrap. And she was not turned into a museum ship. She simply remained there. Over the years, the water began doing what the war itself had failed to do. The metal slowly corroded. The structures weakened. Individual sections began to collapse, and the ship gradually became a wreck. But even now, Nagato can still be recognized. On the bottom of Bikini Lagoon lies a ship that was once one of the most important battleships in Japan, and that is what makes her so unusual among historic wrecks. Most warships lost during World War II remain where the battle that destroyed them took place. Nagato's story is completely different. She survived the war. She survived Japan's surrender. She survived the first nuclear test. And only after the second test did she finally disappear beneath the water. Her final battle happened after the war itself was already over. That is why Nagato is more than just the remains of an old battleship. She is a physical connection between two different eras, the age of the great battleships and the beginning of the nuclear age. The ship that once carried Yamamoto's flag now rests underwater without a crew, without a flag, and without the sound of its guns. But she is still there, nearly 80 years after she sank. Not because she was forgotten, but because after everything that happened at Bikini, there was nowhere for Nagato to return to. Her final resting place became her permanent home. And that is why the answer to the question, why is the Nagato still there, is actually very simple, because that is where her story ended.